Is Qiuyuan future-proof? Let's talk about it. My name is Juice, and let's get into it. Okay, so, I would say that when it comes to support characters, the question of shelf life is honestly a lot more straightforward, because while you might expect that, oh, they're gonna last longer because they're a support, it's more so, they're gonna last as long as whoever they're tied to. Now, obviously, that's going to vastly depend. Some supports are more flexible than others, and some have far more team options than others. It really depends on who you're talking about, but generally speaking, your second slot teammate's value is going to heavily depend on whether the main DPS that they're supporting is still meta or not. For example, if we take a look at Juja, who I personally consider to be a really good pull back in 2.0, I still think she's a really good pull, because Carlotta is still a fantastic DPS. Not even just the only Glacio DPS, even just as a damage dealer in general, that character is still really good and worth investing into, and she stood the test of time, thus making Juja still a worthwhile investment. However, she's not exactly a cream of the crop pull anymore, because Jinshi has kinda fallen off. She's not a bad character by any means, but she's definitely on the weaker side now whenever you look at all of the main DPSs that we currently have in the game. So, whenever you consider that, it becomes a lot easier to evaluate whether Qiuyuan is going to be future-proof or not, and how future-proof he's exactly going to be. Now, I should still add, even if I'm not glazing Juja all the time anymore, I still think she is a fantastic character to get because of how good Carlotta is, and that's basically going to be the case for any second slot teammate that has a particularly good first slot. However, I will also add that it also depends on how much that second slot is doing for that first slot. Because if your support isn't really doing anything for your main DPS, well, then they also just lose a lot of value if they're really easily replaceable. For example, take a character like Roshia. She is the third slot teammate in Forlova teams currently, and she's also able to be used in Camellia teams. However, she's the lowest value 5-star pull in the game. Now, she is mostly a third slot teammate, however in Camellia teams she's a second slot, and she basically just couldn't compete with Sanhua in Camellia teams, and for Forlova teams, she's pretty good, but you can easily use Shorekeeper instead as a third slot, and you wouldn't really be missing out on much. And of course, with Qiuyuan coming up soon, yeah, Roshi is just not really going to be relevant anymore. Not like she ever was, and she did have 5 minutes of fame there with the Forlova team, but she's once again going to be fading into complete obscurity, if she wasn't already obscure enough. So, there's also that. You can be designed for characters that are strong. Forlova's really strong after all, and Camellia is still a pretty good DPS these days and is arguably aged the best out of the 1.x DPSs. However, just because Roshia is tied to good characters doesn't necessarily suddenly mean that she's some future-proof pull that was really good to invest into back in 2.0. Not really. Her value never really ended up shining through unless you count those 5 minutes of fame as her value shining through, and she really helped you free up Shorekeeper for some of her team. There's also a case like Yuno, where the individual unit is really strong and can be played in numerous different ways. However, their first slot doesn't necessarily need them. Augusta doesn't live or die by having a Yuno as a support. However, Yuno definitely does still help her out by a significant margin. It's just that Mortefi is a fantastic alternative. So, you're able to decide yourself whether that additional investment is really worth it for you or not. I personally think that Yuno's case is definitely one of the most fairly balanced cases, because it gives you the most options, and you can still definitely upgrade from there. However, it still makes the unit pretty skippable, but Yuno herself ended up being a very future-proof character, because she just has so many teams she's able to work with, and she's just going to be really good for future heavy attackers in general. So, what exactly is Qiuyuan's case? Well, he has no issue with being tied to good units. You're mainly going to be using him with 2 different DPSs, Forlova and Galbraina. Although he's technically being designed as a Galbraina support, I put more emphasis on Forlova. And this is simply because Forlova is ridiculously meta at the minute. Like, that woman is insane. Really good in Whimpering Wastes, really good in TOA, you get the deal. She is probably the best DPS in the game right now, and if not right now, then definitely after Qiuyuan comes out. So, with that being said, she definitely has good characters to work with, and Galbraina herself is also a very strong TOA DPS. She's weaker in wuwa, but considering that he has synergy with Forlova, I wouldn't really worry about that too much. Though I should add a couple of things. I will say that if you're going for the cheapest possible option for Galbraina, then Qiuyuan is going to offer you best in slot while also offering you the lowest cost. However, if you have a fully invested fusion team, as in you have Brent Wuthering Waves and you have Lupa with Sig, then you're gonna feel far less of a need to get Qiuyuan. However, in Forlova's case, this is just gonna be a straight up upgrade over Roshia, so there's also that. And also, if you don't have max cost on your fusions, then Qiuyuan's gonna end up being a more noticeable upgrade. Essentially, the less you've invested into your fusion 5 stars, the more of a high value proposition Qiuyuan becomes. So, all around, there are plenty of reasons to invest into him, and he is going to be a good character on launch, that is for sure, but how long is he going to last exactly? Well, There is absolutely no doubt about the fact that he has good characters to work with, but is he actually going to be good for those respective characters, or is it a Roshi case? Well, like I said, I think that he is a really good pickup if you're a Furlova main, because he's essentially going to be pushing her to the next level, and because she's already so strong in the meta right now, oh boy, that's a really good thing, especially because A, you're still freeing up your Shorekeeper, which is the same thing that Roshia would be achieving, and B, Roshia doesn't really do much for the Triple Havoc team at the minute. She increases Counterella's damage and provides an Echo skill cast. That is pretty much it. Qiuyuan is going to be far more useful for this team setup. And as for Galbraina, like I said, it's heavily going to depend on what your current investment is already at. For most people, Qiuyuan is going to be a very worthwhile investment. However, if you already have a really decked out Lupa and a really decked out brand, mostly Lupa though, I'm putting the emphasis on her here, well, then you don't really need Qiuyuan as much. However, he's still going to end up being best in slot. So in both of his use cases, he's best in slots, but more emphasis on Furlova here. I would say that's actually where his main value proposition lies. However, with that being said, he is still very much a good Galbraina teammate, especially if you want the highest possible Galbraina performance. It's just that, like I said, if you've invested a lot into your fusions, then the pull does become a little bit more redundant. However, he is still generally going to be a good increase. Then there's the question of how long exactly do we expect Furlova and Galbraina to last as meta characters, because like I said earlier, Juju's still a high value character because of Carlotta. However, her value with Jinshi is definitely decreased, because while she's still a really good teammate for her, Jinshi herself just isn't really that strong anymore, so she's less of a consideration when it comes to propping up the reasons why Juju is a good character. She's mostly good because of the Montelli lady these days. So, when it comes to Galbraina and Furlova, well, Galbraina is incredibly new. That is basically just not a concern whatsoever. She is obviously going to be good for quite a while, considering that she just came out. Like, she is literally a fresh DPS, and as we all know, characters in this game tend to last for a while. It took Shang Liao ages until he got a real direct power creep in the form of Augusta. So, I think she's gonna be fine. Obviously for at least like 6 months or something. I do think that there is power creep in this game, it's just not some rampant thing that's really hard to keep up with. Like, yes, eventually we will get a better fusion carry than Galbraina, just not anytime soon. I think that Galbraina is going to remain as being a very strong, competent character for quite a hot minute. And I believe that in turn, Qiuyuan's always going to have that nice edge of pull value because, well, Galbraina is going to last for quite a while. And in terms of Furlova, listen, if you're ever not confident that she's going to last in TOA, might I direct you to your Whimpering Waste scores? Like, those are ridiculous. The higher investment that you go, the more of a lawnmower she becomes. Whimpering Wastes is a field of untainted grass, and Furlova is a high-end lawnmower that shreds it all apart. Now I will add, I think it's to the point where pulling for a specific upscale for Furlova for wuwa is a little silly, because she's just really strong. Like, yes, Roshia's really good for Camellia and wuwa, but Camellia is just inherently very good at wuwa, so it just wasn't really a necessity back then. I still don't think it is, for the record. However, when it comes to Furlova in wuwa currently, you don't need to go out of your way to pull units for her if all you want is to clear wuwa efficiently. Now, I will add, it's gonna make it easier to clear Havoc-resistant stages, and down the line, whenever it gets more difficult, yes, it is gonna help her keep up with it. So you'd be investing into the future here. However, keep in mind that that's a future that's pretty distant from here. You don't really need to go out of your way to pull the upgrades right now. It is gonna have you set, for sure. However, it's just not really a necessity, and I want to emphasize that, yes, it's gonna be a good pull for her, and your wuwa scores are gonna be even better most likely. However, to say that it's some upgrade that you need to make right now would just not be true. Like, yes, it's definitely gonna help, but you don't need it right now. Unless your Furlova is literally Sigless, you don't have Counterella, you don't have any premium upgrade for her, then sure, I think Qiuyuan is actually pretty appealing then, since you can go out of your way, get an upgrade for her, and she's gonna feel even better in wuwa. But all around, if you have her signature weapon already, and you maybe already have a Counterella, then let's be real, you don't really need to get Qiuyuan this instant for wuwa. However, it is gonna help. And if we're looking at long-term value here, future-proofness, which is the whole point of this video, then yes, this is helping his future-proofness, because he's always going to be helpful for Furlova, who is always going to be a pretty good character at the very least, because she is so broken in wuwa, and it is going to take Kuro a lot of balancing around her, and trying to walk around her, to try and lightly push her out of the meta even just a little bit from wuwa. She's just that good there. Now in TOA, Once again, I actually think that she's gonna be fine without Qiuyuan, because she's just inherently very strong. However, I do actually think the upgrade is more substantial and meaningful here, because it's not like wuwa where it's just gonna be trivial either way. It is actually gonna help you a bit more significantly, and I do think that it's gonna help her stay relevant in the long run. So, personally, I do actually think that Qiuyuan is a future-proof pull, but more so for Ferlova players than Galbrina players, because I find that with Galbrina players, there's enough loopholes that you can find in order to avoid getting him if you don't really want him. However, ultimately, he is the Galbrina best in slot, he's always going to have that value following him. But with Ferlova, yeah, that's really solidifying his future-proofness in my opinion. So yeah, I think he's going to be a pretty good pull all things considered. He's going to be pretty future-proof if you have the characters that he works with, and he's only really going to start to fall off whenever Ferlova starts to fall off in my opinion. And of course, there's his Galbrina synergy. Hopefully this video was able to tell you whether Qiuyuan is a future-proof pull or not. This has been Juice, signing out, and I cannot wait for his release, man.